Today I'm speaking with Brady Hardin. Brady, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
And I was so excited to be able to speak with you because to a lot of us in the deconstruction, deconversion community, you need no introduction. So this is going to be for those of you who don't know you. But
Thank you.
Brady runs an amazing show called the Life After podcast. I'll have the links beneath our video. So please, when you're done, or even before you're done, go pause this right now and go like and subscribe and all that. Hit the bell on his page and just really support his work. The Life After podcast is amazing, and you have it on several different venues. But could you, before I continue with the bio, could you tell us a little bit more about that podcast and what it's all about?
Sure. I started it 3 or 4 years ago with a friend of mine. I emailed them because we came from St. Louis and we were kind of all these Christian. We were in the same like Christian group of friends, of like all these movers and shakers and band members and want to be preachers and all this stuff. And then over the years we'd left the faith, and so I emailed them and said, "Hey, I want to talk about this experience. Would you guys be down for it?" And then my previous co-host Chuck chimed in and said, "Yeah, I'd love to. Plus, I've got the equipment. Let's do this." So we just wanted to interview each other and other people that we knew about their walks away from fundamentalism and how they're finding themselves, how they're wanting to make a change for the culture. And I just wanted to give them the microphone. People who wouldn't have gotten that much attention or privilege inside of Christianity. Tell me your story. And so that's what it's really been about, is conversations with people, courageous people. Courage is whenever we show who we are, right? So it's conversations with courageous people, deconstructing Christian beliefs.
Hmm, that's awesome. And it's
Thank you.
one of the things that's important about it that I just appreciate so much that you're doing. And I'm obviously trying to do something similar. But for so many of us who deconstruct, you would hope for more of a community and a love from the people that you already have in your life. But often there's, you kind of get cut off or sheltered or
Yeah.
shunned. And it's so important to feel like you're not going through this by yourself, and that you're not weird. The fact that you're seeing issues with your previous worldview and belief system, just to know, like, no, this is normal, this is good, this is healthy, and there's a lot of healing to be done. And other people's stories often help us go through that. So thank you for doing that. And I'm
Thank
sure
you.
talk more about the episode later. In terms of your bio, I know that you are from Missouri. Is that right?
Yes, grew up a little bit south of St. Louis.
Gotcha. I've been to the that big, was it they call it the
The
Arch?
Arch. Yeah,
Is
that's
it
ours. Yeah.
That's awesome. That is high. I've not actually I've been like to it at the ground, but I've never been up. Have you been inside it?
Oh, of course. Yeah. There was like a field trip that if you grew up in this area at some point in elementary school, you've probably been up into the Arch.
Is it
We used to,
is it scary
it's
up
a
at the
little,
top?
it does because it sways and it does whatever. And when I was smaller, I had a little bit of claustrophobia, but I also had like the opposite of claustrophobia, that if I was in a big place, I would feel like uneasy as well. So yeah, I got hit by both sides, and the Arch was definitely one of those where you have to go into this really claustrophobic thing, go up, and then you're seen just out, and it's a little daunting,
Hmm.
but
Yeah, our thing was I was from Philly, and our thing was, of course, the Liberty Bell and Independence Hall, and that was so cool to see. But it was like you'd only go there when you had visitors from out of town. You wouldn't go there for any other reason.
right. Well, the Arch is cool too because if you're going out of town and you're coming home, and then you see it on the horizon, it's like, okay, I'm back, and it has
Yes.
like that feeling. The Liberty Bell, you have to get pretty close to do that, or watch a National Treasure movie. But yeah, I hear
I know what you mean. Yeah, we have these buildings not too far from here, about 20
you.
minutes north of us, and or some sorry, south of us. They're called the King and the Queen. They're just two identical, almost identical buildings that right where one major road intersects another one. And
Okay,
I'm like, when you get to the King and the Queen, you know you're almost home. So,
man, I like that.
did want to just mention too that you mentioned before that you're working on a book, or at least thinking about it. Could you tell us a little bit more about what that book might look like if you get to that?
Yeah. I've been going on and off on this project for a long time. For the longest time, I was making it nonfiction, and then I think I had a little bit of an epiphany recently that no, my thing is fiction, and so I figured out a way to kind of talk about deconstruction directly, but in a way in a narrative form. And so that's what I really want to lean on. I think storytelling is so important. I think for a lot of us who were indoctrinated inside of the faith, that's what won us over, not evidence or facts or answered prayers, but storytelling. And I truly believe that storytelling is a superhuman strength that's unique to our species, other than some storytelling that's done by other animals. But like storytelling, where there's a beginning, middle, and end, and all of that, you can transfer information, you can tell lessons that you've learned in your life, and you can encode them into a story, and then the reader can encode them into their own lives. And I think that that's a beautiful thing when done honestly. But indoctrination is when that's done dishonestly. And I don't know. I think that writing something in fiction also kind of has a meta story, a meta lesson in it. It's we can learn about deconstruction through it, but just also the fact that it's done in a fictional story helps us reflect on how we gained information previously as well. Um, and I wrote a Christian novel when I was like in my mid 20s. It was a Christian gospel centered allegory. It was like if can I curse on this show?
Oh yeah.
It's like if Lost and Pilgrim's Progress fucked and then made a really mediocre novel as a baby. And I've always been a story centered person, so this feels like a natural step. But getting back into the creative writing world after leaving fundamentalism, where I felt like everything had to be gospel centered, vomit. Uh, it, Thank you, Rick Warren. I It's hard to get back into it. You have to like retrain your brain, and I'm kind of trying to figure out how to do that process right now.
Yeah. It's interesting that you say that, because one of the things that's fascinating to a lot of us who have left Christianity in particular is that when you first deconstruct, and I'll keep this short because we want to get to your story, but when we first deconstruct, we're kind of like, wait a second, this book was, the word of God. It was perfect. It was so amazing. It was this love letter to us, and it was flawless. And then all of a sudden you're like, there are flaws everywhere, and there's
Everywhere,
genocide and
right?
land theft and slavery and all this. And when you deconstruct it first, you're like, why was I so stupid? Like, this is so obvious that this is not a divine book. This is obviously man-made by tribalistic people. And you kind of get sick of it. You get sick of yourself for being tricked. But then when you come back to it later, like the Stockholm syndrome issue, where you're like, I want to know who was my captor, and you start to really pull back the layers. It's fascinating when you can actually look at the Bible and see it as fiction. Say this is
Mm.
actually a fictional book. This is mythology. That there's actually a lot more in there, like you're saying, the stories. But when you pull back the layers and you see the stories where, for example, you realize that the Jesus character is interplaying with Plato, and he's interplaying with the Homer with the Odyssey and Odysseus, and you're like, they're copying from these stories, and they're literally copying word for word in part from this. And he's interplaying with the Dionysius, the cult of Dionysius. And you're like, they're just kind of weaving their own story off of other people's stories, responding to it, and crafting a different outcome or different details. And you're like, it's actually pretty cool. And especially for me, when you get into astrotheology and you realize some of this stuff is related to the movement of the stars, you're like, this book as a worldview is really sick, but this book is just fiction. It's interesting. It's really interesting. Like, for example, Elisha and when Elisha calls out the two bears to kill the 42 kids, when you first read that, you're like, that's just a horrible story. Bears killing 42 kids just because they said you're a bald man. But then you get into it and you realize Elijah had just gone to heaven on this chariot of fire. And then Elisha is described as a bald man. Well, you got the sun and the moon. And then there's two bears, that's Ursa Major and Ursa Minor, 42 kids. Well, Ursa Major and Ursa Minor have 42 star couplets. You're like, this is a star story. And all of a sudden you're like, this is fiction. And when I go back to it and unravel it, it's like, this is much more interesting. And it's not that you respect it as if you want it to be a worldview, but you do respect it. They did put a lot of thought into it, especially also gematria with the the numerology stuff. That's just, it's amazing, some of the stuff with Pythagoras woven in. Anyway, I digress. We did want to hear your story. You have I've heard your story on two different channels so far, and your story is absolutely fascinating and at times very heartbreaking. So if you could take us back to the beginning, we'd love to hear it, and feel free to share whatever you're open to sharing with us today.
Yeah, for sure. So I grew up here in a city called Arnold, a little bit south of St. Louis. It was a very unstable home. My dad was a deacon. He was also cheating on my mom, and he was abusive. My mom has some mental health stuff that I don't think she's interested in ever confronting or working out. So growing up was not easy. My parents got a divorce when I was like 7, and because my dad was cheating, it was this big ordeal in our church. It kind of blew up since he was a deacon. I really drew to the faith. I remember praying constantly, God, bring me through my parents' divorce, and to me, that's what brought me through. So when I was about 14, I felt really natural to commit my entire future to the full-time ministry, which is an outrageous thing to do at 14. I went in front of my church, did the whole commitment thing, and that's what it was. But then also when I was 14, I realized that I was attracted to other guys, and I never wanted to act on that. I was ashamed of it. I was scared. So I went into repression at 14 as well, and just kind of tried to pray the gay away for years. Finally, when I was 18 or 19, I went through like a mini deconstruction. I didn't read any book but the Bible because I was being tired of being influenced by what I grew up with, of them saying, you constantly talk about the prayer of salvation, but that's not biblical. And I couldn't then base my entire future and ministry on the part that I didn't agree with. And so I didn't read any book but the Bible, and I wanted to find out who God wanted to know God according to who God says he is. I remember that was like a very common theme in my prayer life at that time.
Yeah.
Um,
Like to take
and
away the cultural Christianity and get back to just what does the Bible say?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and at the bottom of that, Tim, I think there was just like I would read the Bible and recognize that the things that I would read didn't match up with what was coming out of it. And I didn't do the whole, oh, that's because us humans, we just fail and we just don't get to me, I'm like, no, this has to do with the Holy Spirit. If it's the fruit of the Spirit where he is, then these things would show. And God promises that we would have like this love and unity. So if I'm not seeing the supernatural love and unity and miracles, etc., what that tells me is that that there's something missing, and I want to find it because I believe that it was still true and that it was out there. So I
Hmm.
would kind of
Like
wanted to
X-Files.
find, yeah, like I actually have like an X Files picture up over here. But I mean, the truth is out there. I want to believe, but and if you asked me, I was through my childhood like taken up. I was abducted by God, and He's the one who got me through my divorce. And so, of course, I want to get to the bottom of that and figure out what it is. But
Hmm.
spoiler alert: I was not actually abducted by God. That's not what happened. I was indoctrinated. But anyway, that was my big thing. And so when I found like a group of like Christian friends that we would just kind of like, we were these like literal liberal, for being Southern Baptist. We were kind of liberal. We wanted to be open to more ideas, social economically. I was more of like a Shane Claiborne. I like sold a lot of my possessions. I could fit all my stuff into a car. I got my degree in biblical studies and theology. I started to be open about my attraction to men, but it was clear that I was never going to act on it. And my faith was my own, and he was youth pastoring at a couple churches, and I wanted to just be part of a church that I agreed with theologically. And so I went to this church and was open about who I was and about being attracted to men, but not acting on it. They became my family. There was these, they were, I live around like Joyce Meyer Central. So these guys went to a church that was more Joyce Meyer like, and then they realized that it wasn't biblical. And so they left and they were trying to find a church that was more biblical. They went to my church. They were one row in front of me, and they had like a checklist of things that they needed in a new church. And I was like, these are the type of people that I love. And they became my best friends. And I ended up marrying one of their sisters and became best friends with them. And the woman that I married, she knew that I was attracted to men. She's very attractive, but she opened up to me about her past. We decided to court. We got married. Things were shaky. They were not easy. I thought she was cheating on me. She had met somebody else, and we tried to make things work. I took her back like 3 or 4 times, but she wasn't interested. And in our church, came in and was extremely manipulative and were treating her like shit. They were treating me like shit. They were trying to fix our marriage because the gospel wasn't doing what it was supposed to do. So they were going to jump in and try to do everything. And it became absolute bullshit. Um, and she eventually filed for a divorce, and they came to me and said that I needed to beg her to stay and ask for forgiveness of anything I ever could have done to make her want to have an affair. And I said, no, that's no. Finally, I was going through therapy for the first time in my life. We were supposed to do couples therapy. She didn't want to, so I stayed with the guy and learned
Can I,
about. Yeah, go ahead, jump in.
can I ask you? You mentioned that they asked you to figure out what you had done wrong to make her have an affair. Is that right?
Ask for forgiveness of anything I ever could have done to make her want to have an
Like where you
affair.
just weren't loving enough or whatever. It's it makes me think immediately if, and then I'll keep this short and please jump right back in for this, but it makes me think in the Old Testament, the Bible talks about Yahweh as like the husband and Israel's like the wife. And you know, when it talks about how Israel went whoring after other gods, other nations, other idols, and God was obviously very angry, but he was also very loving. You know, this whole psycho God mentality of I love you, but I'm going to destroy you, but I still love you. But
Yeah.
back and forth, and then eventually it says God says, I begged you to come back so much, but then I had to write you a certificate of divorce because you were so bad. And I
Hmm.
wonder if the people that would ask you to come to the table and say, hey, you know, this person didn't stay faithful to you, so it must be your fault. If they apply that to the Bible, then you'd have to say, hey, Yahweh, your people didn't
Okay, I see
stay
what you're saying.
faithful. what
Right.
what what did you do? Why didn't you love them good enough? Or they would have been faithful if they just if you had been a great enough partner, they would have stayed faithful to you, Yahweh. It's interesting dynamic, interesting parallel.
Yeah, that is a really interesting parallel there. I appreciate that. I like that actually. That makes sense. And the thing that it makes a little bit more sense with my ex-wife here in a little bit. But yeah, so she filed for divorce. I finally kind of put my foot down because I was learning boundaries and understood what spiritual abuse was. And because I did that, they disfellowshipped me 2 days later without me even knowing about it. I
Hmm.
found out because somebody came to me afterwards and was like, they went in front of the church this morning and said that you are not working on your marriage and that you were to be seen as an outsider. And
Which
like it
denomination
was
is this?
Southern Baptist,
Wow.
Calvinist, yeah, Calvinistic Southern Baptist. So I I lost everything. Also during that time, my best friend, he was a dad, 29, just suddenly passed away of sudden heart failure. And so I was grieving. This was all within like 3 or 4 months. Um, During that time, I was outed to my mom because my family was one that I was never really able to be open with because they're not well. And my mom tried to have my son taken away from me where I wouldn't have him over nights because I was even dating men. I wasn't doing anything. I had not even acted on being gay at this point. This was just like my ex-wife is leaving me, and I was open about wanting, like, being tempted to like say, screw all of this. I just want to date men. Um, I was outed to my mom. She tried to have my son taken, um, and I had to set some fucking boundaries there. I just the whole thing. I lost everybody. I was literally disfellowshipped. Like they were told not to communicate with me unless it is to bring me back to the faith. And I just started to like question everything so hard because up to this point, even through the divorce and everything, I had been, trusting in God and blah 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 blah. So that hit my deconstruction and did it on my own and really kind of I had to like come out on Facebook. There was like God, like 300 comments of people discuss. It was insane. And over time, I just kind of like have been making more of my own space and then holding it for myself and others, taking more space and holding it myself for others, so I can feel more close to being honest with who I am and letting other people kind of benefit from the same things as that. So through this time, my ex-wife messaged me a couple of years ago to tell me that she's in a relationship, and I'm like, oh, that's awesome. Like, we're starting to become friends, we get along well, and at this we were co-parenting of this, forgiven, we're worked past, we are young, blah blah blah. And I'm like, that's awesome, congratulations. She's like, no, I don't think you understand, I'm with a woman. I'm like, okay, wait, what? So to find out, my ex-wife too, like, had queerness that she was having to repress and hide because of how she was raised. She's realized that she's more pansexual. She's married to a woman now. We're really good friends. We co-parent. We get along. And without the Holy Spirit, without God, without religion, we've been able to create a better home life and partnership and co-parenting team for my son than my parents ever were able to do, even with the Holy Spirit unifying them as one family with the Holy Spirit and the fruits of this. It's just um,
Mm.
we're able to do what they say and do it just because we're people who have eyes and a heart and a brain, um, and not
That's
having to
awesome.
present ourselves as superhuman moralist with unifying superpowers.
Yeah. Your story really seems to exemplify a couple things. Number one, the idea of don't shoot your wounded. Like, man, oh man, when people are struggling and down, to come up to them and beat them, it's like, what are you all thinking? Like, is that
Yeah,
really? It's crazy. I've seen that so many times. It's like it's not even a surprise anymore, unfortunately. But it's also it's really interesting how you're talking about, number one, your life is good without a God, but it also exemplifies from the, going straight to Christian theology, there is no power in the gospel. People
mm,
may choose, like, I mean, they may choose with their own self-will. They may choose to be like, hey, I'm going to flip my life around. I was an alcoholic. Now I'm not going to be. I was making some bad choices. Now I'm going to make good ones. And you can blame it on the gospel. You could blame it on, some other God. You could blame it on, whatever, Scientology. You can blame your good choices on whatever and say that's what it was. But if you're actually going to say, no, there's only one God and he's real, and the power is in the gospel to transform lives, your story and many others I've seen are classic examples that it's not there. I know people, many people I could think of, where I know that they were in church every Sunday, church every Wednesday night. They were reading their Bibles every day. They're listening to Christian radio every single day for 40, 50 years. And they're some of the most ugly, cantankerous, mean, nasty people I've ever met. And you're like,
right, right.
you would think if the gospel and the Holy Spirit were real, that at some point God could have used something within that 50-year time span to soften your heart. And it's amazing. It's an interesting parallel to when I deconverted. I have a friend, she's still a good friend. I think she's wonderful, but she's a believer. And her response to me was, it is such a shame that you never got into a church where they really taught you to just hear God's voice. I was like, I was a Christian for 43 years. You don't think God could have spoken in there at some point for 43 years?
Yeah,
You know what I'm saying?
it's very, if you look at it objectively, it follows the power of a story. The people who haven't heard it before, they might be wowed by it. Their brains may change their perspective to kind of fit some of the things. For instance, if, oh, okay, God knows everything. Okay, even in private, I need to make sure that I need to have all of my thoughts in check. Blah. So those are the things that kind of like we put on kind of like VR goggles to make it feel subjectively as if we're doing this, but follow the people that it's not working for. It's the ones who grew up with it, who knew it, who know it inside out and know like the flaws, who've experienced it. It's the test and see that the Lord is what we did, and we know that it's bullshit. So that advertisement, I mean, that's what the gospel and all of this is. It's a marketing thing. So who is the marketing not going to work on? Well, the people who grew up with it and who have already used it, the people, you know what I mean? It's the exact same thing. So what we're seeing is the same pattern um, of a story. Is it going to be able to change somebody or not? And if you look at the attributes of what would make a really outrageous story, um, change, does it change somebody's life or not? If you want to measure that, it's the same applications to the gospel, to a supernatural story, to a whatever. It doesn't matter. Where the gospel is just an example of human storytelling. You could see the effectiveness of it, of like how it can really change and move and even like influence an entire culture. Or we could see like how it indoctrinates and does whatever. But what we cannot see is it doing what it claims to do. The same with false advertisement. That's why we have laws on it, because it fucks with people. It changes their perspective. It makes them become an apologist for a product that doesn't do what it says. So it doesn't really need to worry about that because it's not being measured that way anymore. It's being measured in this completely other way that they've been trained and conditioned to look at it from. And yeah, it's the same things, different stories.
Yeah. And it's amazing too, if you mentioned it, calling it a product, if you were to have any other product that just continually didn't work, and yet somehow you were forced to only pick that, or you were going to be ostracized. Like if someone said, hey, I want you to have this, cell phone service, but you're going to drop calls like constantly, but you have to pick them, or you're a bad guy, or you have to pick this kind of car, but you've already had
Or
two
the
or three of
fire
them.
festival. You got to go to the fire festival or you're just not going to be cool anymore.
Yeah.
And then you go to the fire festival and you realize, oh shit, there's not a festival here. They've left us out in the cold.
Yeah. Yeah. and
Yeah.
and for people to say, you've had decades worth of time to try this, to figure it out, to talk to people, to work through it, to iron out the issues, and you've said, I've done it, I've done extremely hard work, I've done very deep digging, this doesn't work, this isn't reality. And for them to still get in your face and say, oh, but you have to say it's reality, you must. It's really, it's a study in human arrogance, and also this whole, the the power of brainwashing. Like when people, from the perpetrator's perspective, when they get brainwashed from the earliest days, and it is like everything to them, the threat of you saying this isn't real, there is a completely different worldview that's much more reflective of reality and has nothing to do with Christianity. It's like an existential threat to them. It's like you're terrorizing them. Like, wait a second, if I don't have heaven and Jesus and the glories of the gospel, what's left? And that's so scary to them. It's like a truly an existential threat, and yet they can't see past it and say, well, let's examine it, let's weigh the details, let's work through this. Why did you leave? You must have had some good reason. Why did you leave? They don't want to know. Usually they're like, I just, if you're not going to listen to the gospel, I don't want to hear what you've got to say. It's amazing.
And there's also kind of more of a meta narrative too. If you talking about they had decades to kind of iron it out. Christianity has had thousands of years to iron out its bigger problems and everything. And so now whenever people are deconstructing, so much of this space online is dominated by progressive Christianity that has learned how to look at people who are leaving fundamentalism as potential customers and not as spiritual abuse victims. And so they kind of try to dip into this of they're not bringing any more facts to the table. What it is it's another way of how do we improve this product so less people complain about it? Okay, so I hear you complaining about all of the wars that we've done, all of the queer people who've had to repress themselves and die, and all the scientists that have been murdered, etc. I hear you complaining about that. So, listen, we're not going to do that. And in fact, Jesus has been saying this since the beginning, right, guys? And this is our faith, and we don't know why you're offended by it because, you know, we haven't been doing the stuff that you're saying is wrong. But there's no confrontation or exposure to the indoctrination and just the bad source of everything. And if you look at it from like as a product, okay, you've got this product that's been fucking people up for thousands of years, and then you come in and say, okay, let's fix this PR problem. Are you really a progressive? Are you really progressing humanity? Are you really progressing anything other than the lifespan of this failed lie, this snake oil, and doing it while you claim to be aware that it's snake oil? You know
Yeah.
that it's a metaphor. So why are you still selling it? And that's the kind of bullshit now that I'm like,
Yeah.
the hell?
It
What are you
reminds me
doing?
of the, like, I should say a couple things. The Wizard of Oz, don't look behind the curtain. Excuse me. But sorry, I've got a little cold today. But maybe
Yeah.
the Obi-Wan Kenobi, just there's these aren't the droids you're looking for. There is no problem here. There is no problem with Christianity. Say it enough and you'll trick yourself. But it's also like a really good example of I mean, this might be a stretch, but like gaslighting, where it's like you just misinterpreted everything.
Yeah, yeah,
It's your
no,
fault. You're
that's
you're
it.
not interpreting it right.
I mean, I'm queer and I repressed myself for 14 years, from 14 to 28. And queer Christianity, queer theology is my fault. Well, I wasn't listening, I guess, when I prayed to God. God, of course, is cool with queer people. I'm such a fucking idiot. Um, he was talking about pedophiles back then, and the early church fathers who were homophobic. That was just their own thing. And no, fuck you. Like, I lived my life trying to understand and listen to that God. And the fact that he didn't stand up for me isn't my fault. But you have to make it my fault because you're still trying to sell that product. You mentioned Wizard of Oz. To me, I think of Lord of the Rings. To me, it's like if Frodo had the ring of indoctrination and was about to throw it into Mount Doom, but then stopped and decided, I would get a lot of power if I put this on myself. And to me, that's what it looks like. That's what progressive Christianity looks like to me, is to grow in all of this awareness of its flaws and then to say, yes, but how can I perpetuate this to benefit? Um, I I don't get to be a pastor because I deconstructed too much. I deconstructed out of the only career that I've ever wanted in my entire life. And I did that because of honesty.
Mm,
So when other people speak down to me as if I just didn't get it, while they're trying to shut me up so I don't ruin the reputation of the product they're trying to sell, I quickly lose patience, especially whenever it's a straight person trying to tell me that this God loved gay people and it was my fault for not seeing it. Or it's just a gay person who's, instead of wanting to help their community, they want to see themselves thrive in a position of power in a community that hurt them. And I think that's a not helpful way to handle it either.
yeah.
I think people should help each other by sharing what we've learned in our own lives, not what we've been told we should be learning.
Yeah.
When we continue to perpetuate those messages, it's not it's not humanity that's at the focus. It's message focus. And
Mm,
I think I've switched to actually just caring about things that are alive, um,
yeah.
and that can speak for themselves. The Old Testament, there's this part where they mock idols because, oh, they've got feet but they can't move unless you pick them up and move them. They've got mouths but they can't speak. Oh, what a dumb stupid idol you all have. But really, that's progressive God and progressive Jesus. If that motherfucker couldn't tell me himself that he's cool with gay people, and it needed you to come over, pick him up, take him over to me, and then do his little voice for him, and you all have the same relationship with that God as they did as an idol that your Bible made fun of. So I don't know. Let's do this crazy thing where when we talk about metaphors, it's actually about the lesson that the metaphor says and not the metaphor itself. And then maybe that might be a better way to handle God as humanity.
Mm,
And that's kind of where I'm at now, I think.
yeah. And it's amazing too. Once you step back from the edge, so much of the shackles and the chains that had us, you really you realize this was really it was foolish. It was obviously toxic, but it's what gets me over and over, and it still gets me sometimes, almost takes my breath away. It's kind of obvious, and I mean it in this sense, like you just mentioned. I'll piggyback off what you started with. They would say your gods have, they're stone or whatever. They have hands but they can't move, feet but they can't move. They have mouths but they can't speak. But it's like, yeah, but your God is invisible. And it's like, well, you pick which kind of fake God you want. One that you can look at but you have to move it yourself, or one that's invisible and you never actually even see him. But this God that you claim that's there, that's invisible, he he says, I created you. So the implication is I created you the way I wanted you. But now you, his special people, he wants you to cut off the end of the little boys' penises. Like, isn't that like right from the start, obviously an issue? Like, did he make you the way he wanted you or did he not? And then like Abraham and Isaac, you're like, okay, you have this entire culture supposedly where everyone else is sacrificing their children, and you finally have a chance to be different and say, our God is different. Our God, he wants to be completely holy and separate. All of you are willing to sacrifice your kids to your pretend gods, which is so horrific and heartbreaking. We're going to be so different. So we're going to come up with a story where God says, kill your son. Like, wait, what? Like, that doesn't make any sense. If you want Abram to be the hero of the story, then he would say, God, I'm calling your bluff. I know that you really don't want me to. I will say this right up front, I'll never kill my son. But instead he's praised because he says, yes, I will. And then you get this God who, wants you to be careful about which fabrics you weave together and which foods you eat, but he can never say don't own people. And he says, you can beat your slaves till they're almost dead. And you're like, eventually it adds up. And I'm obviously just touching on a few, but there's dozens, maybe hundreds. But you get to a point where like, this should have been obvious. And of course, getting to the biggest of the big ones, God shouldn't need blood or blood magic to forgive. He should just be able to say, I forgive you. The biggest
Yeah.
of all, let's get to the gospel. What in the world does blood have to do with forgiveness? And I mean, you realize obviously it's from ancient Egypt, just like circumcision, but it's like, come on, this should have been obvious. Do you ever feel like, why didn't I see this through this earlier?
I do a lot of times. I think, though, if you're looking at a photograph that's cropped well, it could look like anything. And if that's the only photograph that you grew up with and that you had, um, then I understand it. And you
Good
also
metaphor.
grow up with every adult through apologetics, whether they're formal or just cultural or even social apologetics. Social apologetics is if you stop believing this, then you don't get access to your community. This thing is true, and you know that it's true because if you don't think it's true, you don't get your community. That's apologetics for social apologetics. So when you're brought up with it, that's your only precedent, um, and you've learned to polarize against other information. It makes sense. What I think deconstruction is, though, is we find that photograph that we grew up with, and then we create the rest of the scene, and then we can zoom back and think, you know what? That was actually just a really well cropped picture of a puzzle box. Here's the rest of the story now of what's happening, and you realize, oh yeah, this looks like fucking ridiculous bullshit. But at what age are you supposed to just get the urge and understanding of all the little things that it takes to fill up that picture?
Mm,
You can't. You have to seek for it. That's what deconstruction is.
yeah.
And it's not a how do I recreate this picture and then try to live after it forever. It's more of a let me recreate this and see if this is even a picture I need to be worth living. If not, let me find another one. Let me learn. Let me pick up painting for a while or whatever. Let me find my own shit.
Mm. That's a great metaphor. I love that. That's very, very, and it's exactly what happens to you. It's like very myopic, your blinders are on, and when they fall off, you're like, gosh, this was ridiculous. But at the same point, if, like you said, this, if your community is pressuring you, and especially the way that they really pressure you, I don't know if the word would be rationally, but the sense of like, not just if you deconstruct, you know you're going to get cut off from us, but also this whole, it's self-evident. It's evident that the reason there's something rather than nothing is Yahweh. It's self-evident that there had to be a prime mover. It's self-evident that morality has to come from an outside source. And
It's
they
your
go back to
God. Yeah.
that verse of, with the fool is said in his heart, there's no God. So it's like, rationally, like if you want to deconstruct, what you're really doing is you want to sin, admit it. And they try to pull you in that. And that does threaten a lot of people enough to keep them right in their spot for a long time. But when you deconstruct, eventually even those fall away and you're like, that doesn't make any sense anymore. There's a lot more to this. And if, like you said, the puzzle pieces start to fill in.
A thing that really helped me, I watched a lot of documentaries about cults, and it kind of helped me see how those dynamics came up in their communities, and then seeing the parallels, and then Christianity, realizing, like you said earlier, it's not about the gospel. The gospel's not, who gives a fuck. It's a story. What it's really about is how it's being used. And so when I was able to see other beliefs and other things being used in the same way, the parallel started to click. And the thing that I was taught was supreme, the perfect, irresistible. I realized, or holy. It's oh holy holy. No, it's common as fuck. Everything about God is common as fuck. I could come up with a God right now that shows up in real life just as much as God. And then we the whole time we're trying, oh no, different. He's so different. And how do I know this one's true? Oh, well, what God comes back to life? No, that's not, you're telling me a distinction of how it's different than other. That's not a proof. You've mixed marketing with proof. Like, and that's another part of deconstructing is how to differentiate between all of that bullshit and to get down to real human experience. If that's what we had to live off of, nobody would believe in the fucking gospel because it hasn't done what it says that it would do.
Yeah.
If we are talking about only the things that we know as humans, if that's what we focus on, we would never have time to get around to what a whole bunch of flat earther, women hating, homophobic, Middle Eastern assholes said thousands of years ago so that they can gain control of their government and people. Like,
Yeah.
it, the fact that we still have to talk about what those motherfuckers said, like, is just kind of disappointing.
Yeah, it makes me think a lot like what we're doing effectively, if we were to just boil it down, is we're saying a bunch of people a long time ago, mostly men, as you pointed out, almost exclusively men who were
And the
obviously,
women who were really hot or gave somebody a blowjob in their sleep, and that's their claim to fame. It's like that's Ruth and Esther. That's
yeah,
that's how you be a woman who gets noticed by men. We'll put it that way.
yeah, or from astrotheology perspective, there was, the next sequence of the zodiac was a female star sign, but mostly men from a long time ago, all dead, and arguably very violent, very misogynistic, very sexist, very willing to pillage and to commit genocide, and had slaves that they would beat. Those men came up with a mythology that they clearly borrowed from ancient Egypt, from Sumeria, all the other places that got heavily evolved by the Greco-Roman mystery cults, by Neoplatonism, all this stuff that was going on. And those men are all long since dead who came up with some of the earliest ideas. And then it got passed on to some other men who fought and killed each other and said, I want this book in, I want that book in, no, you're an idiot, I want this version. And then you got, like this canon, and then you got other men all through the Middle Ages who were the scribes who decided to keep in and put out whatever they wanted. And so you got all these men who've long since died, who fought and edited and re-edited and basically manipulated the story the way they wanted it. And somehow the claim is that absolutely needs to dominate and dictate your worldview today, hundreds, thousands of years later. It's insanity that you would even connect the dots that way. And yet it's all over our culture. It's frightening that people are still like even thinking that Christianity is a thing. And you think, well, how many people worship Dionysius? Probably very few. How many people worship Ra? Probably very few. It's probably almost like a fringe cult kind of thing. Like, well, when is it time for Christianity to die out? And yeah, obviously we're going to do our best to end mythology, and not just Christianity, any mythology. But it's amazing that we can't see past this. But like we've said, when you're in it from the earliest days, childhood indoctrination is extremely effective. And it really raises the issue to me of like the burden that we have to protect children. And I was curious if you have anything that's come to mind as you're raising a child and you see other people with their children, like what comes to your mind, and what burdens you about the way that the Christians treat kids with what they're telling them with the worldview and the theology.
A lot of mine has to do with protecting my kid from family members as well, and to protect them from the really indoctrinated ones. And that's a big part of my of my kind of defense. Also, just raising him in a way to understand stories differently. That's been a big part as well. I mean, he knows what stories are real and which aren't, but we also talk about what we learned from them. We sat and had if he's 8 or 9 now, but whenever was it last year, we had like a hour-long conversation about how the Sith represent authoritarianism and the rebels, are more of like a tad rag group of just like human experience. And human is like all these different aliens. So it has to do with how we do storytelling. I focus on future storytelling. I think past storytelling, fantasy, mythology, like the Bible and stuff, they kind of like have this idea that before we could really prove it, all these magical things were happening. But then we got science and then magic stopped, and it's not the case. That's how we told stories. I prefer then, for me, Star Trek, because that, number one, influences me to be a better person in a way that the gospel and the Bible never was able to do. It This is about the greater good. It's about the intrinsic value of a individual. It has to do with empathy and respecting them. It has to do with humanism. It doesn't have to do with appeasing and obedience and slave talk and all of that shit. And there's a consistency in the morality and ethics of that are like displayed and talked about in Star Trek, for example, that isn't there with the Bible. And there's a self-awareness. There's I watched this Star Trek recently where actors and writers and producers from it are coming forward and saying like, hey, here's how we've really helped with women, but here are also the other places where we've kind of like in the 90s failed as a franchise. Here's what we learned from it, and here's what we're going to do better. And that's a thing that the Bible can never do with honesty. That's what progressive Christianity acts like it's able to do. But then we have to forget about the parts of their own text that says, I'm never going to fucking change, bitch. Like, don't try to touch me. I'm the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And then it's like, and then progressive Christianity is like, oh, let's try to like, curve this a little bit and try to, no, fuck it. Be self-aware from the beginning. progressive Christianity is still worshiping a God who is a fucking narcissist. And if you think it's progressive to have a narcissist leader who takes credit for all the shit you do, but never has to communicate with you and follow through, and you want to call that progressive, then you can do me a favor. Go get your own fucking island and live there, because the rest of humanity wants to actually progress and actually improve. And to me, that's like shown well in Star Trek, because all these different cultures coming together and working together for the greater good, getting rid of the xenophobia, getting rid of all this other bullshit. It's about perpetuating values in people, not a fucking story.
Mm, yeah, that's a good way to put it. I like that. And I've always thought it was funny how Star Trek doesn't have, as far as I know, churches or church scenes. And you could easily think, if you were asking the question, where's the church? Well, it's the future. There is no church.
But they're open about that. The in Star Trek, the humanity, because we had to, like, when it says humanity, it means like alien life as well. And that's the whole point of Star Trek, is to take the science fiction theme, like, stage to tell stories about right now and who we are. So it's hit racism and feminism and everything, but the storyline is that um, when we got rid of greed and need, as we have replicators in Star Trek, and so um, needs are met through technology. Whenever we got beyond that, uh, we gave up religion. We gave up greed and need, and like money, currency is also. Star Trek is just like, honestly, like a perfect socialist utopia in the sky. And I love it. But they're very open about, like, no, that they've gone past that, and it's interesting to think of it that way, of what what is religion other than a form of patriotism for humanity. And if we're going to do the patriotism thing, there's always going to be an I'm better than you, especially if your leader is quoted to say things like, I'm the only way, nobody comes to God but through me, I am the son of. Whenever your leader said shit like that, yeah, your religion is going to be a patriotism. It's not going to be a humanitarianism, and that's
Yeah,
a big difference.
and very tribalistic. The whole us versus them. It's
Always.
so divisive. It's insane. Well, I was curious, with going back to your story a little bit. Could you? This is rewinding quite a bit, but
You're
could
fine.
you tell us, when you were a kid and you were presumably in a Southern Baptist church hearing the gospel, what did you hear about the way to God? Like, what was, for anyone that maybe is new to my channel and isn't familiar with this version of Christianity, if someone were to say, say you had a friend come to you that wasn't a Christian, say, "Hey, Brady, I heard you're a Christian. I'm not, but I honestly, if something's happening in me, I need to know, how do I get right with God? I want to make sure when I die, I don't go, somewhere else. I want to go to heaven." What would you have said, or what would your preacher have said to you as the path?
Yeah, so growing up in the Southern Baptist Church, and that's where I started to push against, as I grew up and read the Bible myself. We were more of a prayer of salvation thing. So it was like heavily influenced by Billy Graham, I think, and that whole movement, where they just looked like what they thought salvation or repentance looked like, and then packaged it together as easily as they could into a prayer. And that's what that was, is it was prepackaging these verses about salvation. So it had to do with the ABCs of salvation: admit that you're a believer, or admit that you're a sinner, believe that Jesus can save you of your sins, and then confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord. So that's kind of what it came to. When I got a little bit older, I saw a lot more verses that had to do with repentance and lordship and blah blah blah. But we also believe that faith was by grace, and so being Calvinistic, the way that we kind of reconciled those ideas is, well, God chose those before the foundation of the world, knowing who would, and so our job is to just tell as many as we can, and hopefully blah blah blah, and then He would give them the grace to uh, repent and believe, and faith was by grace all as well. So,
Mm. And the whole mixture too with the of course with Judaism, the idea that there is the need for a sacrifice. In other words, you're what you're doing is you're saying these words, and arguably you could almost think of them as magic words, but you're saying
yeah,
these words. Hopefully, from the preacher's perspective, you're being honest that you really mean them, but there's this behind the scenes, like what is happening transactionally, and it's like God is saying you you are a sinner, admit it, as you said, the ABC, admit you're a sinner, but then that sin has a repercussion. You're going to be judged, and you're going to be judged with ultimate complete finality. Death is going to happen, not death physically only, but death meaning you're going to be separated from me forever in hell. And the idea that you need someone to swap with you. And was that pretty heavy with the preaching that you heard, the whole blood magic? And
yeah. Substitutionary atonement was a big theme for us, and yeah, absolutely, that was all very much part of the blood magic. Without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sin. Yeah,
did you ever get concerned that people would kind of abuse that in the sense of a get out of jail free card, um hey, I did some bad things, but I said the prayer, God, I'm a sinner, Jesus, you're my savior, I'm clean now, like just hit the
mhm.
reset button.
Yeah, and I think that's where a lot of like the lordship teaching and stuff that I leaned into toward the end came from, because
Mm.
there I saw these I saw these passages that had to do with dedication, and I didn't see other people being as gun-ho dedicated as I was, because even as a kid I thought this was what changed my life, and I want to share this elixir with as many people as I can. And that was kind of my influence. And when I, again, when you notice that the things that it says should be there aren't, you start to question. And I was like, why aren't people as dedicated to this as I am, or as other people that I look up to or alongside? Like it. So yeah, whenever people would kind of just want to play the game or whatever, that was a concern of mine. Yes.
Yeah. Did you ever share the gospel with anybody that you remember?
Oh God, yeah. I had committed myself to the full time ministry when I was 14, and I started working at a church at 16. They
Hmm.
made a job for me. Then I was a youth pastor. I did street preaching. I went to mission trips. I've been to the Middle East. I went to Lebanon, Syria, and uh, Jordan. Lebanon, Syria, Jordan. Yeah, and pass out Bibles, and it went, to preach there and told the gospel. And my the novel that I wrote was all about that. Everything was gospel centered, gospel, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. Like
Hmm.
uh, evangelism and you name it. That was me. That was 14 years old. That was my dedicated entire life.
When you look back at that, does it ever strike you as kind of bizarre that they would put someone basically in a leadership position telling people, I have words of wisdom from God, as God's spokesman, as it were, for you as to how to live your life? And I did the exact same thing. I could tell the same kind of story, and yet, like, 14 to 16-year-olds don't know anything about life, and most of them that I've ever seen don't really know anything about where their religion came from. And yet you're supposed to be heavily involved in evangelizing and sharing this, and getting this your church to grow, your youth group to grow. You want so much growth, and you're basically saying, will you sign up as a leader of something that behind the scenes you don't actually know what you're talking about? You don't know where this came from. Did it ever strike you as just it's part of the machine, obviously, but it's like it's
Well,
so
I mean,
inappropriate to do it to young people?
if there was an adult in the room, yeah, but I mean, the people who put me in those positions were just me, but with 20 years experience. Like, um, they don't know where they don't they don't
Yeah.
know where their faith came from either. So it's like there isn't an awareness for them to know. I I had to give myself some credit. I mean, I had some street smarts. I knew uh, I was afraid as I grew up that I was was misleading, these kids or whatever. But when I looked back as a Christian, I was like, I actually feel like I did a pretty good job, surprisingly, and
Mm.
I give myself some credit for that within that context, within that thing. But no, I hear what you're saying. I don't think that it was objectively the most intelligent thing, but objectivity is not a thing that's inside of a Southern Baptist church in St.
Yeah.
Louis, Missouri. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah.
I know that for me, it's been a big source of grief that I was involved in it. I could, in one sense, say I'm glad it didn't go too far, just like yours didn't go too far. I did not become a main pastor. I didn't do too much in one sense, but I did enough that I preached many, many sermons, did many missions trips, and I did go back to some people that I could get in touch with that I knew would be
Hmm.
open to listening. And I actually apologized. And it's funny, one of the guys, he's a great guy, but he had left Christianity, like one of the youth that I had mentored in the church. He had grown up and he went off to college and he deconstructed. So this was like 10, 15 years before I did.
Oh
And
wow.
I heard through the grapevine that this, to me was just a kid because I was, an adult working and everything. He's this guy that just started college. And I heard through the grapevine that he had deconstructed. But I also heard that because of it, a whole bunch of the other youth group kids had kind of cut him off. And I wasn't close enough to him at the time to be involved in the discussions too much. But I heard that they really were not. They were like trying to pressure him, like, look, if you're going to leave Christianity and say it's not real, we can't be close friends with you. And so fast forward years later, I deconstruct and I recall this story, and I reached out to him, and I apologized profusely for my involvement in being a leader in the church at that time, preaching these sermons, leading worship, and I said, I'm just curious, do you have any animosity? And it was amazing to me, but he was like, Tim, everybody at the church has been absolutely graceless to me, and they cut me off, they shunned me. He's like, I hold nothing against anybody. I forgave everybody. I know it's not real. I know it's mythology, but I hold nothing against anybody. He's like, they're the ones with the problem. They're the ones that won't talk to me now. They're the ones that have cut me off. It's like I care about them all and I love them all. And no, I hold no like I'm not holding a grudge against them. And he was like, dude, if I know you need to hear forgiveness, I forgive you, but you don't have to. It's already forgiven. It's no big deal. And it just struck me as like, what an absolutely graceful, grace-filled young man who is completely godless. I'm like, bravo! Like that's exactly the point. You don't need God to be graceful or forgiving. You can do it. And I loved it. I was so appreciative of his attitude and his response to my apology.
Yeah, I like that. I think it's also too like some people though. I think that their version of being grace filled is to hold a grudge and to call that church out on its fucking bullshit too. You know what I mean? Like, I think for him in his situation, that was the best response for him. I think that for some people, the best response for them is to hold a grudge and to call that church out on its fucking bullshit. you know, I
Yeah.
think I'm probably trying to defend myself here, but I, for instance, I was officially disfellowshipped from my church, and there was a woman who tried to give me advice on like friendly advice or something on Facebook the other day, and I had to be like, you realize you're part of the problem. She's like, well, what do you mean? I'm like, you know that you disfellowshipped me. Do you remember when I? And she's like, well, I'm offended that she would think that I would be part of that. I said, what church are you a member of? Where is your husband a deacon? What, did you ever reach out to me during that time? Did you ever? No, you did not. Let's talk about. And that like, the funny thing is her son saw that argument and then he tried to like message me like, man, that's not the right way. And then I talked to him and gave him all the details, and then he ended up leaving the church because he was finally able to get the whole story. And I guess that was my revenge, and I felt really good. I was like, oh, I wanted to like call my pastor and be like, hey, I took one away from you. dick. But, but like that's another thing too. Is like I think some people like are meant to do that, to make that cut because that's what makes sense for their experience. But I think for some experiences, it also makes sense to not make that cut and to let people become aware of that as much as they can too. So
Yeah.
everyone's different, you know.
Yeah. And I think there's times for different messages. I've got a video I did a while ago. It was basically calling out Christianity as hate speech because it does it. God says, I hate this kind of person. I hate that kind of person, stone this person, kill this person. I hate all these people, slash them and slice and dice them. I hate everybody. So many people. It's like God just hating all over the place. And then Christians, oh, but he loves. Well, who does he
He's
love? Well,
love.
he
He's
loves his
love.
elect. Well,
Yeah,
that's not love. That's tribalism. But just and obviously the way that Christians experientially also often are just like we've said, there's no hate like Christian love, where they just love to be obnoxious to people that have left, and it is very painful.
yes.
And sometimes it is appropriate to stand up and just say, like, I'm not here to hold a grudge. I'm not here to dig, but we got to put this on the table and call it what it is. You guys are peddling mythology in a way that psychologically abuses young children, and you want to call yourselves an authority and mature and healthy, and you're nothing but toxicity across the board in every way. And what you're
Yeah.
doing needs to end. It needs to end as soon as possible. And yeah, there's times for sure to speak up, and I do tend to lean toward the idea of I think what I do a lot is I put myself in the spot of what if I was still in it, what would get me out. And I think the angry atheist thing, I think it would get my attention in some ways. But I think if I just knew like this, say I had a fellow person at Bible college, a fellow student who was in the dorm or something, he's like, you know what, Tim, I'm not going to express anger at you, for being a Christian, but I think I have to leave Bible college. I think I'm done. And at that point, if he would have lashed out and said, you believe this, you believe in a God of genocide, I think it would have kind of like stunned me. But I think if he just sat down and said, can we just quietly, let's go get a coffee and just sit quietly and talk through this. I think it would have dropped my jaw a little bit more profoundly. And I think that's where I do get a little bit angry sometimes, and it certainly comes through. I definitely don't hold back at times, but I think I every time I do that, I kind of feel like I'm pendulum them too far, and I kind of like put myself back to, okay, let's take the high ground. And it's hard. It's not always easy. And like I said, like you said, sometimes you gotta call it like it is.
Yeah, I think it's gonna take all sorts of people in all sorts of ways to help knock as many people out of that tree as possible. I've been watching Handmaid's Tale, and I think I relate more with June in this last season. A lot of the last season has to do with, all right, she got out of Gilead. Now what is she supposed to do? A lot of people are telling her, oh, just go to these support groups and teach treat these ex Lydias really nicely and do whatever. But her whole thing is like, no, I'm here to fucking destroy this shit. I'm not here to just hold. And I think that it's just gonna take a lot of different personalities to get a lot of different personalities out of the tree. And I'm not advocating for, I think, what you labeled as like the angry atheist thing, but I think that there is, what I am advocating for is holding people accountable to how they treat one another because of their mythology, and to kind of call that out at times. And I think that's the thing is progressive Christianity isn't used to push back, because they're always used to being the cool older brother who's more sensible. But I think that there needs to be some sort of the type of feedback that Christianity is not used to is from people who have left, because especially fundamentalism, there's all these things in place to quiet them, to get them out of the way, to make them not part of the community anymore. They're cut off, they're not listened to. But what social media and these other things have done is allowed us to have a voice to come back and to now use that as a microphone to speak back to that community. And I think there's a way to do that, that isn't polite, but also is not hateful.
Yeah.
There's a difference.
Yeah.
It's a different spectrum.
towing the line very firmly. And I think too, just to add one last thing to it, I think there needs to be an admission that Christianity has monstrous ideas. And what I mean is, if you were to say, let's look at some of the worst ideas of World War II. Well, some of the players in that were involved in genocide, land theft, slavery, certainly, the racism, tribalism. Our race is good, all these other races are bad and inferior. This whole idea of we want to have a perpetual, this kingdom. We want to have a kingdom of all
Mm.
the good people, and everyone else is kind of either eradicated or slaves. That's what happened in World War II. And you look at the Old Testament, you think it's not different. It's the same thing. It's just a different era. And the fact that Christians can't stand up and say that's a monstrous idea, I will not side with that. I will not call that wrong. Is to me offensive. And it's been interesting when you mentioned progressive Christianity. I right before I left, we were as a family looking for a church, and I'm not from an Anglican background, but there just happened to be some really good friends of ours who were in this Anglican church. And again, my background has nothing to do with Anglicanism, but it was kind of like as close to Anglican Calvinist as I feel like I could get at the time. And every other church that we looked at wasn't that good. So we went to this Anglican church for a few months, and this was right before my deconstruction. And I talked to one of the pastors one time right after my deconstruction, because he was, wanting to follow up with me a little bit. And he he said, "You know what, Tim, you make some really good points." And I said, "Well, how do you deal with them? Because you're still in the church. You still believe in this Yahweh God." He's like, "I don't actually think they were the same God. I think Yahweh was a different God." And he said, and I said, "Yeah, but that's not what the Bible says." He's like, "Yeah, but well, you can interpret it different ways." And I was frustrated because I was like, "Well, yeah, but I don't think that's what most Christians think, and you're kind of representing a lot of Christians here." And his response was, "You know what, Tim? If I honestly believed that Jesus was the same God who committed the genocide, I'd have to leave too." He's like, "The only way I can stay in this is by saying they're not the same God." And it was like he was doing these mental gymnastics, and I didn't feel like it was getting very far. But he's a pastor of this church, and I'm sure some of my friends would say, "Well, that there's Anglicanism for you." But regardless of denominational differences, you have to be honest. If you're going to say Yahweh is God, He is the one I stand for. He's the judge of the earth who will do right. He's not just the judge. He's the good judge. He's the good Father. Then, and if Jesus is the same as Him, He's the Son, but He's also the same. I and the Father are one. Then you're saying Jesus was in charge of and commanding genocide, land theft, slavery, child brides, all that stuff. You can't say you're a good person and defend that, and yet Christians do. And that to me is where that gets me a little bit heated. That gets me a little bit angry. Like,
What?
you can't say
It's
it's wrong.
bullshit. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's bullshit. Think of Trump. Like, if people follow Trump by faith because they've been giving the judgment, the judgment is so and so is good, is good. If you get that judgment first by faith, now I believe this judgment, so and so is good. What is missing? Well, the evidence and the things that support it. When you take something by faith, you're taking the conclusion, and then there's a vacuum of that evidence. So you're going to shove everything that you can into that fucking vacuum because you've just been conditioned to make the conclusion, and now you've got a vacuum and you've got to fill it. So if Trump said, "I am the definition of love, I am love," and then your response is, I need to filter out and ignore all the times that he was unloving, you're fucking indoctrinated and you have made a fool of yourself. Your Anglican pastor is done that thing, but for Jesus. Jesus is good. So now I'm gonna use any mental gymnastics I can because for him, what would require less effort? Trying to shove some fucking nonsense and then into an abstract idea that you can't really check the answers on. You just have to kind of take your word for it, or lose his community, his income, and everything because he realizes that he's professionally indoctrinating the next generation, so they can professionally indoctrinate their next generation. But they're
Yeah.
There's no awareness. It's all talk. We want to talk about how great God is, and then you say how and why, and then they're gonna act like you've just murdered their pet. Um, it is patriotism for Jesus. That's
Yeah.
and the reason that I get vocal about it is because as somebody who's deconstructing, that's my if we're gonna frame it this way, I wanna be like a deconstructed minister, and so I want to care about my flock. And when I care about my flock, and I see a whole bunch of them being told, "It's your fault, God didn't work out, you dipshit. You just didn't understand God right," or "Yeah, God's powerful, but He's not like that sort of powerful." I know He promises that He would never do, like, never give you a snake when you ask for a rock, but hear me out. This is why He only gives out snakes. When that's like your thing, there just comes to a point where you just need to learn to shut the fuck up and care about your own goddamn species. Care about fucking humans more than you do about a fucking deity. Like, for Christ's sake, focus on what is actually here and what's among us and what's actually harming each other, instead of taking all of your empathy and shoving it up some deity's ass. Because your deconstruction and your indoctrination, he wasn't the victim of it. Oh my God. You guys believed the wrong things about God. You thought that he was homophobic. Poor God, I feel so sorry. No, fuck that shit. Care about the gay people who've repressed themselves, and now we're being told that it's their fault for not understanding God right. Like,
Yeah.
fucking focus on what matters. And if I could have a way to just be a pastor like I've always wanted to be, and how I literally planned my entire life from 14, I would do it for Christ's sake. Like, I didn't just give up all of my goals and dreams because I wanted to be an angry atheist. Hell fucking no. Um, I had to give it up because I became a humanist, and I realized that everything that I was doing was anti-human. It was all pro deity, and you can't have both, especially when the fucking deity gives instructions of how to smash my head in with a rock because I sleep with other men, or because I disobey my parents, or whatever. Like,
Yeah. Where you pick up
it's
sticks on Saturday.
insane. When else, where else is it appropriate to carry around a book today in 2021 that gives instructions of how to kill women and gay people? And what other book do we give that grace to? Do we just be like, "Oh no, it's cool"?
Yeah.
No, they're the good guys though, don't worry about it.
Yeah.
No, we
It's
don't do
amazing.
that. We don't do
Or
that with anybody.
or if a woman gets raped in the field, just tell the guy to give the daddy 30 shekels of silver, and then you get to take her home forever. It's insane what we let pass through. And there's the story I was going to piggyback off your story about the, it says Jesus talks about, I think, the Sermon on the Mount. God is going to take good care of you, and he says, if your son asks you for bread and a fish,
Bread.
won't you give him that, or would you give him a serpent and a rock? Like, no, of course, your good father would give you bread and a fish, and not a serpent and a rock. And then he says, well, your heavenly father's so much better than that. Well, that's what you said is exactly what happened
Show
in the Old
me.
Testament. They had a chance where they complained. They said, God, please give us food and water. He gives it to them, and immediately it says he sends vipers to kill them all. Like, that's exactly what he does. He sends them food and says, while it was in their mouth, he sends vipers to kill them. Like, that's exactly the psycho God you're talking
It's,
about.
yeah.
It's in the same book. It's crazy.
All of the marketing is gaslighting in the Bible. And it astounds me that people are like, yeah, but how can we make it progressive gaslight?
Yeah. Speaking of some of the bad stuff, I did want to give you a chance to talk through the whole issue of homosexuality. I know that when I was growing up, it was kind of assumed that it was so fringe that, honestly, we in my church, we didn't even talk about it that much. It was just like, there's some gay person somewhere out there, somewhere, probably. We've never met them. You probably won't. And if you do, you'll know them because they're very, very weird and strange. And, try to stay away from them. Don't let them influence you too much. And certainly don't let them into your kids. But it was like, okay, we're all the same here. We're all, straight white people pretty much. And it was very sheltered, obviously. I don't think if a gay person to come into the church, they would have felt very welcome, or they would have at least had to stay quiet. And I think that's probably typical of a lot of people's experiences. What was it like for you, especially like in terms of the messages of eternal damnation, and even just
Yeah.
the issues of the not sheltering, shunning that could have occurred if you came out?
Yeah, I mean, it's like you grew up with this idea of like those people, those people, those people, but then I realized I am one of them and I don't want to be, and I didn't choose to be, and I'm choosing not to be, but it was still there and it's still who I am. And well, fuck, right? So that caused a lot of psychological damage growing up, repressing that, having to keep it a secret from people. And then whenever I wasn't keeping it a secret, I was into a lot of like the lordship theology, which taught if you're struggling with the same sin for a long time, then that's a good sign that you're not really actually saved. And so then I'm freaking out about that and doing everything I can to it's just, it was a fucking shit show.
Did you get
And
compelled
yeah.
to ask for God to save you multiple times as a
Oh
result?
God, yeah, yeah. There was, I never acted on but it was always just even the fact that the temptation was still there.
So you
It's been
doubted
a
your
lot.
salvation as a result.
At times, yeah, I doubt it, but then also that cycle of shame and of need. When you doubt your salvation, it also includes the upside of that, of doubling down and going through that like begging for forgiveness thing too. And so yeah, I doubted my salvation, sure, but I think that's just one very small part of a much more abusive cycle that really just fucks with people's minds.
Yeah. And the reality too is that even if I keep seeing your cat back on, that's so cool. It's two of them, right?
I've got I've got two of my own, and my roommate has two, so there's four fucking cats living in this goddamn
Wow, that's a
apartment.
busy place. Oh,
Yes.
I was going to say, even if you were not bringing homosexuality into the discussion at all yet, even if you were, heterosexual, you're still right from the start in the church dealing with the issues of you are bad, bad, bad. Don't think, don't look, don't, if you look twice, you certainly have a problem. Don't look at that magazine.
Hold
Don't look at,
every thought captive.
yeah, don't
Yeah.
look at that certain section of the ladies clothing store, whatever. And you're already buried alive with the guilt of, well, I did look twice, no one saw me, but I did look twice, looked actually three times. And even if I didn't look three times, it's in my head now and I'm thinking about it, and I kind of don't want to think about it, but I kind of do. And maybe that's like, oh, I should be guilty, but or feel ashamed of it, but I don't. But then I do really feel shamed later. And like you ping pong people back and forth, and you get this Jekyll and Hyde mentality where it's like a double life, where you're supposed to
Yeah.
look good as a Christian, but you have this double life. And if you are honest with people about what you're struggling with, they'll bury you alive with the shock of like, you're a bad guy, you're not good. If you're struggling with that, then you must be really not honoring God. So you're kind of pushed, especially if you're going toward ministry. But so then you're pushed to, okay, well, I either need to not have this other side of me, or I need to hide it and have a kind of a private, mental second life. And so people are, and it amazes me over and over, the Christians who I follow a lot of pages on Facebook and other places where there are Christians who are calling out abusive youth pastors or pastors who are molesting somebody. And obviously that is horrible beyond horrible. But I'm also shocked that they're not taking into account the system that set them up to do it. Like, you can't just say, well, these are one-off bad guys. No, you have an entire system.
It's a systemic issue,
Yeah, you
right?
train them to have two different lives. You train them to have a closet to hide in and to do things and to feel dirty, but to have a public life where they feel clean, and to keep them utterly polarized, and to feel like they cannot merge these two lives. You cannot be a Christian and be whatever. You can't be sexual. And I remember as a kid growing up seeing girls where if they had, heaven forbid, um, uh, a child out of wedlock, they had to get in front of the whole church and apologize. I'm so sorry. I'm
It's fucking
sorry.
bullshit. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's crazy. What kind of support did you eventually build a community to think through that? Did you go through it all alone, or like, did you have anyone you could eventually
Yeah,
talk to about
I
it?
had I had therapy was huge. I ended up finding the Christian therapist at the very beginning was helpful, just understand what spiritual abuse was. But then once I left the faith, I had a not a Christian therapist, and then just kind of like having to build the Life After podcast, and like a couple of those friends that I noticed on Facebook were also kind of doing some weird stuff, but there was no yet.
Yeah.
So that's when I message everyone, be like, hey, we're kind of let's do something. So yeah, it was kind of not having that community is what pushed me into wanting to create it.
Yeah. That's awesome. I was curious, a couple more questions. When you began to heal from all this stuff and began to think through it all, you're deconstructing, somewhere in that mix, obviously, you actually made a choice to say, I don't believe anymore. And so we've kind of talked about a lot of aspects around it, but the actual decision to say the Bible's not divine, the gospel's not real. Can you tell me a little bit more about what specific things you thought through or researched, whatever you say, however you say it? What brought you to the point to actually say, there's no way this is reality? I don't believe anymore.
Um, the biggest one was believing that the Holy Spirit that unified Christians. When I went through all that spiritual abuse and realized I was my own with it, um, that was a big thing because the Holy Spirit's a big deal, and the church is supposed to be a big deal. And I know what I was praying. I know my heart, and when people didn't follow through, that became clear to me that there was something missing. Another one too, just kind of caring less and less and less, then doing the podcast, and then we had a guest who talked about how even like some of the old gods like El still have remnants in the Bible of before they were edited out, and to realize like, oh, we were polytheistic. Huh, that doesn't add up. And like just taking God and Jesus at their word. If they're going to say some shit, then all right, follow through with it. If you're going to be the only way, show me how you're different, because when I compare you to the other religions, you all are using the same fucking mental gymnastics. I don't see any difference. You are not holy, holy, holy. You are same, 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 same. Um, and then it all just kind of went from there.
Hmm. Was it a shock to your system in the sense of when it finally hit you that maybe there was no afterlife, or like, how did you deal with those questions about what happens when you die?
Heaven always seemed kind of fucking stupid to me anyway. I'll be honest. Like subconsciously, it never forever with these people. Like God, you want to say you're all great and worthy of praise now, but it just didn't seem real to me. It didn't seem whatever.
Hmm.
So I just I don't know. I just my that was never a big thing for me. I guess like heaven never really. I did a lot. Do you remember like judgment houses and all of those? Like I used to do all of that shit, and hell was always fun to decorate and create. You know what to do. You get to put some cool like Satan stuff in there, but then like the heaven room was always like white walls, weird music. It just looks like a fucking cult or something, and it just never really clicked with me, I guess. So that really wasn't a big thing that I had to mourn or get rid of, I guess.
Hmm. It's interesting.
Hmm.
For me, it was a more painful thing. I know what you mean. I think I had always had this sense that when we were when we would be glorified, we would have the mind of God, and we would see reality so differently that something like if you said, well, how long can you really sing worship songs to God? That when we're there, it would somehow feel entirely appropriate and wonderful. Like I just got this sense that like it just like an orgasm, you know, you would be, it would somehow be
But
orgasmic nonstop. And like, but you can't imagine how he can make it that way, but he will. So when you get there, it'll feel like, oh my goodness, this is a wonderful thing. And so
but have
to,
you ever seen those interviews with like women who have that horrible dysfunction in their body where they have orgasms constantly?
no,
They're never happy. It is not a happy situation.
mm,
And I hear what you're saying too, like the orgasmic feel, but then I'm like, too much of a good thing is not a good
yeah.
thing.
Well, I think part of me too, like, you know how some people, this might not make sense to some people, but some people just, they just love to learn. They just love to study. Like if you told me, hey Tim, I'm gonna lock you in a library for 10 years, just you and some food. No, you're not going to talk to anybody. You're just going to be in the library for 10 years by yourself. I'd be like, awesome, I'll do it. Um, I love to learn. If someone said, next, you're going to now get stuck in a room for 10 years just learning how to paint and paint and paint. And I would just, you know, next 10 years are going to be just learning how to play chess. And next 10 years of traveling. I just would have been like, I will take it. I want to do it all. I want to be the best. I don't want there to be any craft out there that I can't excel at, that I can't, I don't want there to be a single piece of furniture or artwork that I couldn't say I can make that with my own hands. Um, any book, I'd want to say I've read them all. And so to me, the idea of eternity sounded like just wonderful. Like, of course, I want to keep learning and growing. And how do you stop meeting new people? You know, there's billions and billions and billions of people. I want to meet every one of them and hear their story. That'll take eternity. And so to me, it was just a glorious thought. And every part of me wanted to live forever. And when I realized, you know, like you just, I was at this computer almost like 2 years ago exactly. Almost by about two, in about a week, it'll be 2 years exactly. Um, Realizing as you thinking through it, shit, this isn't real, is it? And then like, shit, there's no afterlife. This isn't real. And it was like that scene in the Matrix where they're first explaining to Neo that, you know, you basically were just a battery. And then he's so upset and they pull him out, they unjack him and he just vomits. You're like, you're so upset at realizing what was really happening. It shook my system badly to realize there's
Yeah.
no afterlife. And it's interesting how different people respond differently to that. I think too, I didn't have too many people that had died at that point in my life that were really, really like, oh, I can't wait to see them again. But I'm sure for the people for whom it's like, okay, I've got so many loved ones, to realize I'm never going to see them again. I'm sure that's a big part of it for some people too.
Yeah, I guess that's a benefit of having shitty family.
Yeah.
But you know what's funny too is like when you're describing heaven, everything that you're saying is just very human centric. There's nothing about it that had to do with God.
Yeah.
To me, like I was like such a God centric, like everything to do God, just worship God, 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 God. Yours was just like I just want to be a fucking introvert for a while in a library, and everything you said or listened to people's stories, everything was just very human based. I think it's awesome. So like,
Yeah.
yeah, I would more in a human based heaven, but that just really wasn't part of my mindset, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. It's probably made part of it a little bit easier. What was, could you contrast the kind of the emotional piece you had as a Christian versus after deconstruction?
Yeah, I emotionally I'm just a lot more aware. I think I went through a lot of weird mental health cycles on a regular basis of shame and everything, and was just at the mercy of whatever I was feeling in that time and not understanding my own mental health, not understanding my own like neurodiversity, and not having therapy. Everything was just based on the few tools that were handed to me from people who never should have been parents. So now I'm so much more in control, so much more knowledgeable. I'm self aware. Whenever there's a feeling of insecurity or whatever, I'm able to identify it and not have to wrap in this whole other invisible character that's supposed to be the main character but doesn't ever show up to set. There's just a lot of it's a lot less complex, but then now I know more, and that makes some parts complex, but in good ways. So yeah, my mental health is a lot a lot different and just a lot more knowledgeable and understanding.
Hmm. I was curious with your podcast again, and I want to make sure we touched on it and gave you a chance to kind of talk it up a little bit. But the Life After podcast, I was curious when you're talking through people's stories, and I'm just looking here down at some of the looking at your YouTube page and some of the titles and so forth. You talk about a lot of different topics, but I was curious if there's any themes that kind of hit you where you hear the same thing more than once about people's stories, and just any kind of insights that you feel like you're gleaning as people share their journeys.
Oh, for sure. Just learning about humans, how humans make things work in the situations that they're in, I think is really interesting. Um, Also, ending repression is a big thing of just people finally. There's always like this build up of feeling like you're going to feel this horrible shame and guilt and everything. But as I talk to people, it's like, nope, I felt free and I felt at home finally after my body in my body when I did that. That's like something that I never get tired of hearing. Yeah, just like one theme that I love that always comes up is just people finally standing up for themselves and their humanity, and not being a little apologist slave for a deity anymore, but to talk about the representation of their own experience instead of the advertisement of another's. And that shift is always
Mm.
a big theme that I like to see.
How often do you hear people talk about like being shunned or left in the dark, so to speak, left in the cold by family and friends? Do people share that kind
Oh,
of response a lot?
oh yeah, a lot. I mean, the last episode that I did, that's out whenever we're recording this, is my friend Sherry, Reverend Dr. Sherry Paulus, and she was like kind of just treated like shit by her mom because she was not following the Bible's sexual ethic codes. But and she lost family because of that, and that's heartbreaking, and that's fucking bullshit. And with the gays, queer community, that's normal for us. Like it, being, I don't. I don't have contact with either of my parents anymore, because of it, and yeah, just having to lose dozens and dozens of people in your life just because you are who you are, um, that's bullshit.
Yeah, it's amazing kind of what you're sharing. One of the things that's been on my mind a lot, and I'm probably going to do a little monologue on it at some point, but it's like when you deconstruct it, I think it's really important for us who are deconstructing to try to understand what this looks like from the Christian's perspective, because to them it's traumatic too. And I get that. And I've got a lot of people that do a really good job of reminding me of their perspective, that they're from their side, they think this is real. They're just trying to raise their kids to think the best thoughts, to love Jesus, to live the best life, to make a difference for eternity, to be as healthy as they can be. And from their perspective, they're making great choices, and to them you're making the horrible choices. And so I get it, that that's important to see from their side, to put ourselves back in the shoes we used to be in. So, and I totally, for anyone who's watching my video, that it's there's several of you that do that on a regular basis to remind me to do that, and I appreciate that. So point very well taken. But I really think it's important too to go to the other side and say there is a bit of a betrayal. It's a bit like the trauma betrayal that's going on here. They're betraying your humanity. Like you might say, all right, well, you all married, committed to Christ. So if one of you says, well, I'm not committed to Christ anymore, I don't even think he's real, you've betrayed me, betrayed the gospel. But there's always like a higher calling, and that is we're not called to believe just in um, a religion or a worldview. We're called to pursue the truth. I don't mean called as in someone else, but just like it's the best way to live, in my opinion, is to pursue the truth and to take it wherever it leads you. And so, for example, if you were to say, well, I live in XYZ country and I'm very committed to my government. I love my country. It's the best. Well, that's good. It's good to be patriotic and committed to your country and to sing the songs and fly the flag. Great. And, it's Olympic time, support your team. Great. But if your team, I'm sorry, if your country, if your government starts to do something really horrific, it might be time at that point to take a knee at the football game, or to do something different, to stand up and say, I am going to take a different path. I'm going to take a different stand because the truth took me somewhere else. I've got something higher than just my immediate allegiance. I'm going to take the truth where it goes. And so when you deconstruct, you're saying, I'm willing to take the truth to whatever path it leads me to. And someone else is saying, what a horrible, horrible choice, and what a horrible person you are for doing that. And in them saying that, and sending that message, which I get so many messages of people saying that kind of experience is happening, they're betraying your humanity and saying, I am more committed to this, Canaanite demigod and to this worldview than to you as a human. And the other side of it is like, it's like a death. And I like to describe it like about, I don't know, 7-8 months before my deconstruction, my physical dad had died. And I'd gone to the funeral up in Pennsylvania. And when I was deconstructing, I was thinking, it's kind of like a funeral where, your dad is like your dad for a few years and then he passes, but your heavenly father's like your father forever. And I was thinking, if I had been at my dad's funeral and someone had come up to me and said, I'd like to spit on the casket, or I'd like to just cause a ruckus and say you're a bad person. Like, dude, this is a funeral. Respect the funeral. We're here to grieve my dad's passing. Respect my grief. And if someone was just like obnoxious and trying to cause a big ruckus and riot, be like, what in the world's going on? And yet when your heavenly father, so to speak, dies and you have a funeral, and it's a real grief. I mean, you really go through a grieving process. Instead of them respecting your grief and saying, I'm so sorry for what you're going through, instead they turn into like mini terrorists and attack you over it and call you a bad, like, I'm grieving and you're going to call me a bad person. And they're literally creating, like, you're already traumatized from realizing this isn't real, this is mythology. And they're adding all kinds of other betrayal trauma, betraying your humanness, betraying your experience, betraying your journey.
Wow, yeah.
And making you into a bad guy. And it's like, it really is a heartbreaking situation. And for those who go through it, I just say, I'm sorry. I know it's painful.
You brought up a lot of really good points. I brought this up a couple of times, but like with progressive Christianity, it's like I was trying to have that funeral, and they were saying he's not really dead. He's not really dead, man. He's not really dead. He's not really dead. He's not really. It's fine. It's fine. All you have to do, man, is just look at it just a little different, and he's not really dead. And to me, that wasn't good enough. It would be like if I tried to sign in to a login and it didn't recognize my sign in, it didn't recognize my account anymore, and then I had to start over with this whole other idea of God, because whatever. So no, I hear you on that. That's completely true. And then another thing that you said that really, God, makes sense is where it is kind of an attack at your humanity, because the thing that got you out is common to all humans: observation, learning, figuring things out. Um, and if you did that and that got you on the other team, then evaluate your fucking team. Don't evaluate my observation skills, my ability to listen to the expectations that you're selling me, my ability to see those aren't adding up, and then the humanity to then have the sense to go somewhere else. Fuck you for doing that. Sure. If that's sure. Yeah. Fuck me for doing that then. But you're absolutely right. The human recentering the human experience is what deconstruction does. And my experience with progressive Christianity and things like that is it's still an advertisement. There's not any other observable human experience that's being added. It's just telling you you can you can have your cake and eat it too. You can have the benefits of worshiping this xenophobic piece of shit, but you can ignore the parts where he's xenophobic against you. Just make sure that you keep it about our team and whatever. Yeah, fuck it.
Mm.
I want to focus on what we all have in common as humans. I don't need to tell you what we should have in common. We have it already. Um, what is that fucking verse? How would they know unless somebody told them? How would they be told unless somebody is sent? Yeah, that's the same with any other fucking conspiracy theory or lie, because the people depending in it, people believing on it is 100% dependent on being told that story. Observation and objectivity allows us to see what is naturally there and to talk about that. That's that's humanity, not this
Mm.
faith bullshit of I'm going to give you a judgment and now it's your job to fill the vacuum with anything you can. Um, no, we're done with that bullshit, and it's time to end it. It's time to stop.
Yeah, for sure. Well, speaking of that, all that, I did want to ask related question, and this will be my last one. Then, if there's anything else you want to add, this on your mind, feel free. But we've talked a lot around the idea of deconstruction, of changing your mindset, changing your worldview. Your podcast is all about that, about people's journeys through that. One of the things that happens a lot with us who've gone through it is that you kind of feel like you don't know who you were, because your identity previously was in Christ and the church. And so you're grounding, the carpet's pulled out from under you. You knew who you were because of your relationship to your Heavenly Father. And once you and at every little nuance of life, like your sexuality, your role in life, even your gender roles, in marriage, whatever, everything was clearly spelled out. It was not that gray. It was pretty black and white as to what you were supposed to think and do, and who you were, and where you rank in the world, so to speak. And all of a sudden, it's like you realize none of that's ever been real. And you're first dealing with just the trauma we talked about, of like realizing this was mythology, Christianity's mythology, any version of it. But then you kind of stop focusing on what was the Bible real, is God real, and you eventually kind of get rid of that enough to focus it, bring it back to yourself, and you're like, okay, I'm done thinking through the Bible now. I did my homework there. I'm good. I know that's not real. So where does that leave me? Who am I? Like, and you bring in obviously things like scientifically, like, oh, okay, if I was like a 6,000-year-old creationist, a Ken Ham kind of person, like, okay, well, maybe evolution is part of this story. You start to think through the implications that I'm not made in God's image. I'm one of a big chain of our species, and we're not done yet. If we can keep from killing ourselves, 10, 20, 30,000 years from now, we're going to look different. 100,000 years certainly. And I'm where I am for this season, for this day and age, and I have a place that's very different than I thought. And my purpose in life, like, how do I have a purpose? My purpose before was clearly to bring people to the kingdom of God. Now my purpose is undefined. How did you think through all that in terms of your identity and your purpose? And again, be my last question. Then if you want to add any other thoughts to that, feel free.
No, so I mean, it also is tangled up with me coming out, and it was all kind of a one thing. What I would recommend people do is make a playlist of your favorite songs, and when you're feeling a little lost, go back and listen to that. That helped ground me. Just little things like that. Also, finding what TV shows that I like, those hobbies that we always felt bad about wanting to talk about constantly in church, but then realized that it wasn't enough about God. Dig into those. For me, I had to do a lot with television. I'm a huge Star Trek fan now because I love the themes and the humanitarianism that it teaches. I love like its self-awareness, its intersectionality, its queerness now. God, Star Trek is so fucking queer and I love it. Find those hobbies, find your voice, find what themes you like and you don't like, and create a library of your own interest instead of just going back to the one book Bible. Um, really kind of having to create that identity and find that space was hard. But because people have kind of like created spaces for you to do that now, it's going to be easier for you and for others, because you'll be able to be in contact with others who are going through the same thing, and they get what you're saying and can confirm you're not crazy. So finding those sort of things is going to be helpful, and creating who you are. Everything that you had in the Bible was given to you in fundamentalism as an all or nothing prepackaged thing. Your deconstruction is a discovery of that you can find all of those things in better places, in better ways, a la carte. You don't need to find your entertainment from the same place you get your history, what you think is history, at the same place that you get your community rules and your commandments and your entertain. You don't need to do all of that at the same spot. Focus on humanity, and that has so many more colors and variations than um, the Bible.
Mm.
So yeah, I think that's what I want. I want people to find themselves. I don't want to be like, okay, now listen to me, subscribe to my channel, and I'll tell you the way. I would rather say, hey, follow my channel, subscribe to my channel, for as long as you need to find the tools that you need to create your own shit, to create your own path, to create your own way. I don't want to sell ways. I don't want to peddle snake oil. I want people to learn how to find their own way and to get the good parts that they had from their faith, but find it even better in the real world, and to help come alongside me and other people to destroy the shit that's harming people and to quit that culture.
Mm.
Um, yeah, that's about it for me. That's what it all boils down to.
Yeah, good thoughts. I love too just how it kind of came up in one of the things you said there, but it's come up in some of your other podcasts, that the idea of I'm not the only one. Like I thought I was the only one, but there are other people going through this, and we can support each other. We can help each other. Yeah, we're all a little different. Some of us have been, in what we would have called cults like JWs or Mormons. Some of us have been deeply affected by purity culture, and others haven't been. Some of us have been
Mm,
involved in Calvinism, others haven't been. But whatever your journey is, there's some similar dynamics. And honestly, it seems like just the biggest one is just the starting point of being brave enough to say, I've always thought of God as like unchallengeable. The Bible I can't question, God I can't question. He's the judge. I just bow my knee to him. And to say for the first time, I'm going to have the bravery to say, I'm going to become a critic and a skeptic, and to say it's okay to do that. It's okay to say, if something sounds wrong here, I'm going to face it wholeheartedly.
yeah,
I mean, it's
that's
so
your
obvious on this
humanity.
side, but it's hard when you're in
Yeah,
it.
I mean that's your humanity. That's you learning to prioritize your humanity over the story, over the idolatry, over the patriotism. And what's funny is when you talk about that common experience of what makes me know that I'm not alone, when we talk about those experiences that we all have in common, they're more distinct and they're more common than any supernatural, oh God answered my prayer bullshit. That if you got 20,000 Christians in the same room, they're not going to come up with similar stories of what they think are miracles. But they're sure as hell going to come up with similar stories of what's spiritual abuse and what's sexual abuse inside of church. That shit is what is distinctive and common and shows up, not the supernatural bullshit. And our humanity is what tells us to prioritize the real shit
Yeah.
and to take care of the real shit instead of fantasizing and
Mm.
whatever about the magic that none of us are experiencing.
Yeah. That's well said. It's interesting how often too, so many of these things, what they feel like they're little steps, and you feel like even at the time you're not really deconstructing, you're just asking good questions. You're like, well, why, Did Jesus cleanse the temple once at the beginning? Did he cleanse it once at the end, or was it twice? Why is it different? Why does it look like there's two stories of creation in the first couple chapters of Genesis? Is it one story or is it two? Same thing with the Noah story, blah, blah, blah. All these little questions. It's like, I'm just asking some good questions to be a better Christian, to be a better apologist. And I describe it as like, when you set up dominoes and you can tip the first one, they all fall. Well, it's almost like if you were a mile, like you had your dominoes of your worldview set up real nicely, but you're a mile away. So as you're kicking, all your little kicks don't do anything because you're just still a mile away and you don't realize it, but you're slowly making a beeline right towards your dominoes. And all those little steps you took of deconstructing, the Genesis story, the Noah story, or the Jesus character, or whatever, or like you said, even the El character, and I love getting into like Elyon and his wife Asherah, and then Yahweh has Asherah as the wife. It just all these evolutions of the Yahweh character, and you don't realize it, but you're just like slowly taking step by step till to the dominoes, and then all of a sudden, you take one last step. Like someone shows you one last thing, and you're like, boom, you take one, and you thought you're just taking just another step, just like every other step, and all of a sudden it falls, and you're like, wow, look how far I've come, and look what just happened. And I describe it to like I used to be a cabinet maker, and I used to do a lot of construction. And if you make a really heavy door, like if someone asked you how, I want one of those monster doors, it's like 3, 4, 5 inches thick, and it's a heavy antique door, with like the leaded glass and stuff. I want a door that's so heavy, and of course you have to have some really hefty hinges that you install with that, because it's such a big door. And when you try to push it at first, it feels as heavy as can be, but after it's installed, but because you've got these great hinges and they're very well greased, once you get that momentum going, that door will just keep on sliding. And it's such a scary thing at first, but I want to encourage people, it gets a lot better. If you're in the throes of it, it gets better. And the fact that you're like, oh, what just happened? I didn't realize I was kicking dominoes down. It will scare the daylights out of you, but it does get better on the other side. It really does.
And you figure it out. You find yourself. It works. It works.
Cool. What I did want to ask, is there any other questions I didn't ask you want to bring up today?
No, I think we hit so many good things today, and I really appreciate you letting me come on and speak today. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, it's been awesome to get to know you. So everyone, again, we've been speaking with Brady Hardin with the Life After podcast. I'll have all the links beneath our video, so please, again, check out his stuff. Amazing work you're doing. So many of us daily could say thank you. You're making a big difference to all of us. So keep going, and we appreciate all the groundwork you've laid for so many of us, and appreciate your time today.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks, Brady.